if you happen, and I'm sure you don't, but if you happen to be actually watching this on a computer or you're watching it on a phone or something like that, as technology, as we get propelled into seemingly working at the speed of a machine, not a human, which of course is much faster, keep making sure that you use those machines to infect substantial acts of beauty into the bloodstream of them, that you get good things out into the world. So it would have been about 3 years now since word has filtered out that I would have become a God botherer and become a Christian and actually entered the Orthodox tradition. And that would mean often in a Q&A, at the end of an evening's event, someone would have something to say about it. But generally speaking, other than, a perennial sense of disappointment and little sparks of anger, that has actually moved a bit to some curiosity now. And I would have been talking recently about, the old saints of Ireland and Egypt and these other places, and the necessity for what I've been calling the interior mountain. And someone called out, it was a woman actually, she said, and where now is the desert? For us, where's the desert? The desert as a real place, the desert as a metaphor, the desert as a symbol, the desert as event. Where is the desert? So I wrote an essay about that, which I will have attached somewhere. Hopefully there's a PDF you can read if you want to in a more extended form. But I'm trying to gather a few thoughts here off the cuff, and where is and where could be the desert. So we know in early Christianity, around AD 300, when Rome takes on Christianity as the national, or as the nation religion, we all feel a little unease at that. We wonder about the power balance. We wonder quite what has happened in it. It would appear Christians at the time grew anxious too, because it is around that time that this sort of Christians who would remember vividly being outlaws in a way start to move out into the deserts of Egypt and other places. And there seems to be a need to return to some core listening, some values of mystery, of service, of solitude, of community, of nature, all the stuff we hear podcasts about to this day, delivered from a laptop in Hoxton. So I would have a particular interest in that kind of thing because I've been a wilderness rites of passage guide for almost 30 years now. Whilst that isn't entirely within the Christian tradition, it would bump into some of the aspirations that I have just described. Wilderness rites of passage fast is 4 days and 4 nights in a place where you don't eat. You sit usually in an old forest if you're with me, or sometimes on a mountain top or by a river, some isolated place where clock time loses its purchase on you, and you get to hear the murmuration of nature around you. You get to hear a little bit of your own disquiet. You get to hear a little bit of your own still small voice. If you're very lucky, you may have an encounter with what John Moriarty used to call divine ground. So this feeling that the worm, as William Blake would say, is sick, that there needs to be a course corrective spiritually in the heart of the West, I would say amen and yes and yes and yes. The question about whether or not that is something that is going to be adopted by an entire religion or group of people, or secondly, as you get in Islam and as you get in Christianity, is a particular kind of faction doing a particular type of work. Those are the kind of questions I'm interested in. Is it time as a culture we walk back into the forest? St. Anthony is probably the most famous of the early desert fathers, desert mothers as well, of course. But St. Anthony is the one, this would be late 3rd century, beginning of 4th. And by the time he died, he had been so successful in the work he did. He'd been so, ironically, by walking away from people, they often end up following you. And his biographer, his earliest biographer, said Anthony made a city of the desert. And I'm not sure how pleased Anthony would actually be by that. But the thing that really struck me about Anthony's life was that he didn't just have one base in the bush, he had two. And you could visit him by the Nile, and that was where a lot of his sort of students or disciples were. And that place was called the Outer Mountain. And for many of us, the Outer Mountain would be more than enough. And because he was a convivial and decent fellow, every now and then Anthony would show up at the Outer Mountain, and you'd see him and he'd talk and there'd be discourse. But what was less known was there was a slim, difficult path the other side of the Outer Mountain to the Interior Mountain, much harder to get to, much more treacherous, much more severe, much more site-specific. And it's on the Interior Mountain that Anthony spent a lot of his time. And I think when I was growing up, I have to be careful about this, because you can slander your upbringing sometimes without even knowing you're doing it. You can just kind of throw it under the truck. But I think on occasion I would have been exposed to what I would have called Outer Mountain Christianity, not Interior Mountain Christianity. I've long suspected that the personality of the West seems to be extroverted, and the religion that we would choose would have a strong will center at its center, because the will is relatively easy to mobilize. And especially when you have something like the Great Commission, the idea to get the word out there, once there's power attached to that, all sorts of things can happen. And we've been living in the consequence of, churchianities for the last 2,000 years, with all the schisms and the glory and the grace and the trouble and the derangement that human beings get up to when they're faced with the almost impossible mandates of Jesus Christ. I've often said that, for me at least, I can't imagine that to seriously entertain what Jesus is, telling us to do would require nothing more than a protracted nervous breakdown. It seems so not anti the world exactly, but the world turned upside down, maybe. So too much Outer Mountain, too much extroversion, not enough being asked of us, and the Interior Mountain, which is the thing that requires work and requires repetition and is not just dependent on high emotion. It's the Interior Mountain is to do with fidelity. It's to do with showing up. It's to do with a practice. I go to Divine Liturgy as an Orthodox Christian, and that is not dependent on whether I feel like going or not. I'm going to go. And in the doing of the thing, in the repetition of the thing, I learn a lot about what it means to be Orthodox. I learn a lot by kissing the icons. It's a physical tradition. The liturgy itself is a slow form of dance. So all of these things bring me through what I would call epic tradition, not lyric. We can get to that maybe. They bring me into an encounter with something that is deep and has proved to be, for me, quite luminous. So I wonder if we're missing that in the West, and the current fascination with orthodoxy could be people suspecting that and having a feeling, which I'm going to argue, that unless Christianity redraws that interior path to that interior mountain, there won't be enough to invest in. The outer frame is just kind of calcified because it is caught astonishingly in some kind of trance state where it is trying to appeal to a culture, not a culture, a society. Culture's too good a word, culture, colère, to dig. not that, but a society that has absolute ambivalence. It has enlightenment values. It's not interested in the things, the fundament that the church is actually based on. So what do we do about all of this? Well, for me, the longing for, we call it the wild, you could call it freedom. The longing for the desert, the longing for the forest is a thing long established and catered for in my life. But Jesus, Yeshua, who I actually follow, is not entirely a creature of the desert. We know through his life that he moves back and forth between cities. He moves between, settlements. Then he recharges his batteries early on in the day, as it were, talking to his father. That's a terrible analogy, technological analogy. But one way or another, he's a weave. Jesus is always in a place you're not expecting him to be. Come on. So I find the notion that a great cultural withdrawal, a kind of a quietening, is not realistic for Christianity at large, but tremendous attention would be required in getting back in touch with that interiority, that mystery, that sustenance, that sense that we are taking our cues not from worldly matters swirling around us, but the God that stands with one foot in the universe and one foot outside. C.S. Lewis said in his first book of prose, really, the Pilgrim's Regress, that at some point Mother Kirk, meaning the church, is designed to rather fall apart every few hundred years. And then it is the big dreams that God gives us, or the big pictures, actually, he calls it. And the road of the Jewish people, it's that combination of pagan pictures and the road of the Jews that regalvanizes, reimagines, and forges in a way that she as church, Sophia, can continue. And it's almost designed to happen somehow. It's that notion of no pressure, no diamond, that we need to be. I think Christians are at their best sometimes when they're in a slightly outnumbered and outgunned. It's not very good necessarily where they are in the power all the time. There's an enormous history of things going horribly amok. But that isn't, I would argue, a corrupted religion. It's our absolute abject failure to live up to the mandate that Christ bequeaths us with. But I said earlier that I'm a wilderness rites of passage guide, and I mentioned that it's 4 days in the desert because you've got to tell you there are as many mad people out in the bush as there are saints. There's far more mad people out in the bush. It is not for everybody. A man of tremendous significance for me was a Lakota elder called Wallace Black Elk. I remember Wallace saying to me, longer than 4 days in the bush fasting is what he called too much great spirit. Too much great spirit. It's like being caught with Job in his wonder eye to a point where there are no words left. That is the point, to kiss the hem of your God and withdraw. So the desert, I don't think, harbors hurt feelings to us, amazingly, or the forest or the mountaintop. We can still go there. We can still have these mighty, powerful, redemptive, informing communications. But the real problem, this is what I've been getting to, the real problem actually is not that the forest and the village are closed, the forest is close to us. It's the village, it's the place we return to. It's society that we return to actually has active hostility to the kind of information that we receive. As Joseph Campbell once said, the role of the community is to torture the mystic to death. And so I think there's always going to be trouble between the words of someone like Yeshua and what we as human beings struggling and trying to get ours. There's always going to be a useful tension in there. I say useful because I think that is part of the business of what makes a human being, that we learn to live in what Keats the poet calls negative capability. I think a Christian needs to be both steadfast and restless. The steadfastness comes with the tradition, but the restlessness comes with the Holy Spirit, who goes where he will and turns up in the most unlikely of places. God will always work in ways that at some point we thoroughly disapprove of. So what would we do? My personal thought would be, whilst I would encourage far more, on just a really literal level, spend more time in nature, spend more time around the gospel of a cormorant or a heron, spend more time attending to the dawn and to the dusk, become creaturely in your senses again, go out and touch the world that at one point gave God so much happiness, so much glee. But we also have to think about that can't be a situation that is removed from the culture that we return to. Community is a word that has been a pebble in my shoe for many, many years. Community is good when you accept the fact that a third of your community are not alive, that they are, well, they're alive in the way they are. A third of your community should probably be the saints, or your honourable, venerable ancestors, the ones that aren't too conflicted and mad. It's lucky if we have ancestors and not ghosts. So you want to look towards what I call the merry. Now, the merry is a word, Merry England, Robin Hood. Merry is the creative village absorbing profound prophetic information from the forest or the wilds or the desert fathers and doing their ceremonial work on it so it can be masticated to a point where it becomes a village wisdom that we can comprehend. And if there is enough of the forest in the village, we are less likely to be completely corrupted by our own ambitions. I know this is an enormous stream of thought, but that is what I would suggest that we need, and this is something in my own work I feel connected to. We need literal time out in the living world to listen to it in the same way we would attend a gospel or a teaching story. And at the same time, we need a more creative, more devotional attention to silence. Actually would be a really good thing, what in Orthodoxy we call hesychasm. But for me, a combination of the merry and the forest is something where the desert, do you remember we're leading back now to what the woman called out that first time for me, and where the desert in all of this? We need more desert. We need more forest. But I also don't believe that the inevitable way forward is the absolute abdication of all technology and the abdication of all cities and all towns and all of that. That seems to me to lose an awful lot of nuance. My suggestion simply would be this: if you happen, and I'm sure you don't, but if you happen to be actually watching this on a computer or you're watching it on a phone or something like that, as technology, as we get propelled into seemingly working at the speed of a machine, not a human, which of course is much faster, keep making sure that you use those machines to infect substantial acts of beauty into the bloodstream of them, that you get good things out into the world that have significance, substance, beauty in them, fidelity in them. You can chuck them all, you can smash them with a hammer. That could be your routine. You might want to go a kind of Amish route. But for the rest of us, we are going to be living in the tension of the village and the forest. And there has always been a tension between them, because in the last few hundred years, everything has been freighted so heavily in the way of the city. I associate more and more churches now with urban centres. I mean, it goes right back, I suppose, to Paul and who he was writing his letters to. He's writing his letters to people in towns and cities for the most part. I leave us with the image of those wonderful churches in Ethiopia where they are always surrounded by a small wood. And I think that would be a wonderful thing if we said, wherever we build a church, we have to build green around it, or we have to let green erupt out of the concrete again. And we go and sit quietly in those places and see what God has to say through that. These are just small things. This is just me hurling a shoe at the moon. But it's a start and to be continued.